In the courtroom, my own mother stood up and told the judge I was mentally incompetent, that I had been unstable my entire life and should never be trusted to handle money. I didn't argue. I didn't even look at her. I just sat there inside the Hennepin County Government Center in Minneapolis, Minnesota, wearing my grandmother's pearl earrings and waiting. Then the judge leaned forward, studied the attorney beside my mother, and asked one quiet question that changed everything. "Counselor, do you truly have no idea who this woman is?" My own mother stood in court and told the judge I was mentally incompetent. Her voice carried clearly across the quiet courtroom, calm at first, almost rehearsed. Then it sharpened, rising just enough to make people look at me. The bailiff near the wall, the clerk typing steadily, even the strangers waiting for unrelated hearings. According to her, I had always been unstable, emotional, irrational, unfit to manage money. I didn't interrupt. I didn't defend myself. I simply sat at the respondents' table inside the Hennepin County Government Center in Minneapolis, Minnesota, hands folded neatly, wearing my grandmother's pearl earrings and waiting. Silence makes people uncomfortable. Most assume it means guilt. They rarely consider that silence can also mean certainty. My name is Elena Cross. I'm 33 years old, and until 3 months ago, my life was painfully predictable. I worked as a forensic financial analyst for a private investigations firm in Minneapolis, specializing in elder financial exploitation. Cases where trusted relatives quietly drained savings from aging parents or grandparents. My job was to follow numbers until lies collapsed. I had testified in courtrooms across Minnesota more times than I could easily count, just never from this side of the table. 3 months earlier, nothing about my life suggested I would end up here. I lived in a modest apartment overlooking the Mississippi River, filled with secondhand furniture and stacks of case files. I promised myself I would organize someday. My weekends revolved around visiting my grandmother in Maple Grove, a quiet suburb where lawns were trimmed perfectly and neighbors still waved from driveways. My grandmother, Ruth Cross, raised me after my parents divorced when I was 14. My mother, Diane Halpern, remarried quickly and slowly disappeared from my life. No dramatic fight, no official goodbye, just fewer calls, then none at all. Ruth never criticized her daughter. She simply filled every empty space my mother left behind. She'd been an elementary school teacher for nearly 4 decades, the kind who labeled storage containers and balanced her checkbook every Sunday morning without fail. "Numbers don't take sides," she used to tell me while tapping her calculator. "They just wait for someone patient enough to read them." I didn't know then she was shaping my future. She passed away 8 months ago. Congestive heart failure, peaceful, quiet. I was sitting beside her hospital bed when the machine slowed, holding her hand while winter sunlight filtered through the blinds. Her last words weren't dramatic, just a reminder to water the plants and not forget the spare key under the flower pot. She left me everything. The house in Maple Grove, her savings, a small insurance policy built slowly over decades of careful living. It wasn't wealth, it was stability. And apparently, stability was enough to bring my mother back into my life. The certified letter arrived 3 weeks after the funeral. A formal notice from an attorney stating that Diane Halpern was contesting the will. According to the filing, Ruth Cross had suffered cognitive decline. According to my mother, I had isolated her, manipulated her, and convinced a vulnerable elderly woman to leave me her estate. Then came the accusation that changed everything. My mother claimed I was mentally unfit to manage finances. She petitioned the court to appoint a conservator. Herself. I remember laughing when I first read it. A short, disbelieving sound that faded quickly once reality settled in. Because accusations don't need to be true to cause damage. They only need to exist. Within days, my firm placed me on administrative review, not punishment, liability protection. An expert witness whose mental competence was under legal challenge couldn't testify in active investigations. My calendar emptied overnight. Depositions reassigned. Clients transferred. 7 years of credibility paused with a single filing. My boyfriend, Lucas Bennett, tried to reassure me. "Courts deal in facts," he said one evening while we sat at my kitchen table. "Truth wins." Lucas teaches high school history. He believes systems work because they're supposed to. I didn't argue, but I knew better. because I had seen cases where lies survived longer than they should, simply because no one looked closely enough. The night before the hearing, I sat alone reviewing old photos of my grandmother. One picture showed her smiling beside me at my college graduation, pride written across her face like I had accomplished something extraordinary. She always believed preparation solved most problems. So instead of panicking, I opened her online banking records, accounts she had added me to years earlier, just in case. At first, everything looked normal. Utilities, groceries, pharmacy charges. Then one transaction caught my attention. A cash withdrawal. $4,000. Unusual, but not impossible. I scrolled further. Another withdrawal. $6,000. Then another. My pulse slowed. Not faster. The way it always did when patterns began forming. I opened a spreadsheet automatically and started entering dates. By midnight, a realization settled over me like cold air. Every withdrawal occurred within days of a recorded visitor entry at her neighborhood gate. And every visitor had the same name, Diane Halpern. I stared at the screen for a long time. The woman accusing me of exploitation might have been hiding something far worse. I stared at the spreadsheet long after midnight, waiting for the numbers to rearrange themselves into something harmless. They didn't. 7 withdrawals, each larger than the last, each labeled simply as cash, the one form of transaction my grandmother avoided whenever possible. Ruth Cross trusted records, receipts, and paper trails. She disliked anything that disappeared without explanation. Yet nearly $50,000 had vanished during the final year of her life, and every withdrawal followed a visit from my mother. I leaned back slowly, the chair creaking beneath me, forcing myself not to jump to conclusions. In my work, assumptions were dangerous. Patterns meant nothing without confirmation. Still, instinct whispered that this wasn't coincidence. It was timing. The next morning, I called my attorney, Marcus Levin. Marcus had the steady patience of someone who had spent decades watching people lie under oath. He listened quietly while I explained what I had found, occasionally making small notes I could hear scratching through the phone. When I finished, he asked one question. "Do you want to use this immediately?" Legally, we could. Introducing suspicious withdrawals could weaken my mother's petition before the hearing even began. But something about the situation felt unfinished. "She filed too aggressively," I said. "People hiding fraud usually stay quiet. She pushed this into court fast." Marcus hummed thoughtfully. "Meaning?" "She thinks there's no evidence left." Silence followed, the kind lawyers use when they're reassessing strategy. Finally, he said, "Then we wait. But if we wait, we build carefully." That part I understood perfectly. My suspension from work made waiting unavoidable. Without active cases, my days felt strangely empty. I found myself waking at the same early hour anyway, reaching automatically for files that no longer existed. The absence of routine left too much space for thinking. Lucas noticed immediately. "You're pacing," he said one afternoon, watching me walk circles through the apartment. "I'm working," I replied. "You're not," he said gently. He wasn't wrong. I wasn't working. I was replaying memories. Conversations with my grandmother, moments that felt ordinary at the time but now seemed important. Had she mentioned money problems, confusion, anything unusual? Nothing clear surfaced. Ruth had always protected others from worry, even near the end. That evening, I logged back into her banking portal and dug deeper. I expanded the timeline to 2 full years. Most transactions followed familiar rhythms. Grocery stores every Thursday, pharmacy visits monthly, donations to her church exactly twice a year. Then, 11 months before her death, the pattern changed. Cash withdrawals began appearing. Not random, gradual, like someone testing limits. I cross-referenced dates with visitor records from the gated community where she lived. The Homeowners Association kept digital entry logs, a detail I had barely noticed before. The overlap was exact. My mother visited. Money disappeared days later, again and again. I felt my stomach tighten, not from anger but recognition. I had seen this structure before, in case files, in investigations where trusted relatives convinced aging parents they needed help managing finances. Slow extraction, small enough to avoid alarms, large enough to matter. Marcus called later that night. "I reviewed the petition again," he said. "They're requesting temporary account control before the hearing." That explained everything. If the court froze assets under her authority, access to records could become complicated, delayed, restricted. They weren't just challenging the will, they were racing the clock. "We'll oppose it," Marcus added, "but you need to prepare emotionally. They'll push hard." I almost laughed at that. Emotion wasn't the problem anymore. Clarity was. After the call, I sat quietly at my kitchen table, staring at a framed photo of my grandmother reading on her porch swing. She looked peaceful, unaware of the legal battle forming after her death. A memory surfaced suddenly, her voice teasing me years earlier. "If anyone ever cheats me," she'd said, smiling, "you'll figure it out. You always do." At the time, it sounded like a joke. Now it felt like instruction. I opened a new spreadsheet labeled simply Timeline. Every withdrawal, every visit, every detail documented. The process calmed me instantly. Facts replaced fear. Patterns replaced doubt. And as the rows filled, one realization became impossible to ignore. My mother wasn't trying to prove I was incompetent. She was trying to stop me from looking too closely. Sometimes the smallest detail, and the one you almost scroll past, is the reason a story begins to change. And for those who keep following it, the truth rarely stays hidden for long. By the third night, the investigation stopped feeling personal. That was when I knew I was thinking clearly again. Grief had blurred everything at first. The funeral, the legal notice, my sudden suspension from work. But numbers have a grounding effect. They don't react to emotion. They simply wait to be understood. And the more I worked through my grandmother's records, the more the pattern sharpened. 7 withdrawals weren't random. They were structured. The amounts increased slowly, almost cautiously, as if someone had been testing how much could disappear without attracting attention. 4,000, 6,000, 8, 12, escalation without panic. It was the behavior of someone who believed control already belonged to them. I printed the transaction history and spread the pages across my dining table. Highlighter in hand, I marked dates, cross-referenced visits, and added notes the way I did during active investigations. Every highlighted line connected back to one name, Diane Halpern, my mother. Seeing it repeated in ink felt different than seeing it on a screen. Screens feel temporary. Paper feels permanent. I checked timestamps next. Most withdrawals occurred mid-morning, the exact window when my grandmother usually attended community activities or church meetings. Times when she wouldn't question errands being run on her behalf. That detail made my chest tighten. Someone hadn't just taken money. Someone had studied her routine. The next step felt inevitable. I drove to Maple Grove early Saturday morning. The house looked unchanged. Pale siding, trimmed hedges, wind chimes moving softly in the cold air. For a moment I sat in the car, unable to move. Returning without her felt wrong, like entering a story after the main character had already left. Inside, everything remained exactly as she'd kept it. Shoes aligned near the door, mail stacked neatly on the counter, the faint scent of lavender cleaner lingering in the air. I forced myself into work mode. Emotion later. Evidence first. Her filing cabinet stood beside the kitchen table, drawers labeled in her precise handwriting. Utilities, insurance, medical, taxes. The earlier years were perfectly organized. Then, about a year before her death, the system began to unravel. Loose papers. Receipts missing explanations. Envelopes without notes. At first glance, it looked like age-related forgetfulness. But I had reviewed too many exploitation cases to accept that explanation easily. Disorganization can be natural, or it can be engineered. After nearly 2 hours of searching, frustration crept in. I had confirmation of suspicious withdrawals, but nothing directly linking intent. Then I remembered something small, the safe deposit box. She had added my name years ago after a break-in scare nearby. I'd visited only once and forgotten about it entirely. An hour later, I sat inside a private viewing room at North Star Credit Union. A metal box opened before me. Inside were expected items, jewelry, bonds, personal documents, and something unexpected, a worn leather notebook. My grandmother's handwriting filled the first page, dated 14 months before her death. I sat down slowly and began reading. The first entry described a phone call from my mother, the first contact in years. Apologies, regret, promises to reconnect. Grandma wrote she felt cautious but hopeful. The next entries changed tone. Requests for small loans, stories about financial struggles, repeated visits, each one documented carefully, each amount written beside the date. My breathing slowed as realization formed. She had been keeping records, not casually, intentionally. Halfway through the journal, the handwriting grew shakier. One entry stood out. Linda had asked her to sign paperwork to help manage bills. Grandma wrote that she felt foggy that day but trusted her daughter. 2 weeks later came another entry, written more firmly. She had reread the documents during a clear morning. They were a power of attorney. She ended the entry with a single sentence. I think I made a mistake. I closed the journal briefly, pressing my palm against the cover. This wasn't suspicion anymore. It was evidence, recorded by the person it happened to. Near the back, an envelope fell loose onto the table. Inside were photocopies of withdrawal slips and handwritten notes matching the bank records I had already found. She had known. Maybe not immediately, but eventually. And instead of confronting anyone, she documented everything. Because that was who she was, a teacher. A woman who believed truth should be written down so someone else could understand later. Someone like me. As I gathered the papers carefully, one thought settled heavily in my mind. My mother hadn't filed that court petition to win money. She had filed it to bury this. And now that I had found it, the hearing wasn't just about defending myself anymore. It was about exposing what she thought would never be discovered. I didn't leave the credit union right away. The viewing room was silent except for the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. The leather journal rested open in front of me, its pages filled with my grandmother's careful handwriting. Steady at first, then gradually uneven as the months passed. I read every entry twice, not as a granddaughter. As an investigator, the difference mattered. Emotion wanted outrage. Investigation demanded sequence. And sequence told a clearer story than anger ever could. The early entries sounded hopeful. My mother had apologized. She claimed she wanted to rebuild their relationship, to make up for lost time. Grandma wrote about feeling cautious but willing to try again. She had always believed people deserved second chances. That belief, I realized, had made her vulnerable. The visits began politely. Coffee, conversation, small favors. Then requests followed. Temporary loans, unexpected bills, business troubles involving my stepfather, Greg Halpern. Each time, Grandma recorded the amount she gave. Each time, she reassured herself it was helping family. But as weeks passed, the tone shifted. Shorter sentences. Questions written in the margins. Why does she rush me when I read paperwork? I feel confused after she leaves. The words felt heavier than any accusation, because they weren't written to convince anyone. They were written to understand what was happening. One entry stopped me completely. December 14th. She described signing documents while feeling tired and mentally foggy. Linda insisted it was routine paperwork, something that would make things easier. Grandma admitted she didn't fully read it. 2 weeks later came the realization. She had found the documents again during what she called a clear day. Power of attorney. Legal authority transferred. Her handwriting pressed harder into the paper as she wrote, I was embarrassed to tell Elena. I should have known better. I swallowed hard. She hadn't told me because she was ashamed. Not because she didn't trust me, because she blamed herself. The final pages became more deliberate. She began documenting visits precisely, times, conversations, even moods. One entry described my mother becoming irritated when questioned about missing funds. Another noted Greg searching through file drawers while she rested in another room. The pattern wasn't subtle anymore. She knew she was being taken advantage of, but she didn't know how to undo it. At the back of the journal, a folded letter waited, my name written across the front. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Elena, if you are reading this, it means I waited too long to explain. I thought I could fix things quietly, but I grew tired. Linda believes I forget everything. Sometimes I do forget small things, but not the important ones. I kept records because I knew you would understand them. Please don't feel guilty for protecting what is yours. Truth matters even when it hurts. I closed my eyes, letting the words settle. She hadn't just documented events. She had prepared me. Back home, I spread the journal beside my laptop and began verifying details. Every entry matched the bank withdrawals. Every date aligned with visitor logs. The consistency strengthened the case beyond coincidence. Then I examined the power of attorney document itself. The signature was hers unmistakably, but the notarization stamp caught my attention. Something felt off. The font looked older, slightly faded compared to modern seals. I opened the Minnesota Notary Registry and searched the listed name. Robert Klein. Status: commission expired 3 years before the document's date. I stared at the screen. An invalid notarization didn't just void the document. It suggested fraud. Serious fraud. My heartbeat slowed, the way it always did when certainty replaced theory. I dug deeper into public records connected to Greg Halpern. Property liens appeared first, then business filings marked inactive, debt notices, collection actions, financial pressure everywhere. The picture formed quickly. They hadn't targeted my grandmother because of family reconciliation. They needed money, and once access began, they escalated. I called Marcus immediately. He listened without interrupting as I explained the journal, the forged notarization, and the financial history. When I finished, he exhaled slowly. "This changes the entire case," he said. "Civil?" I asked. "Potentially criminal," he replied. "If this holds up, investigators will want to see it." I looked down at the journal again. For weeks, I had felt like the defendant. Now I understood something important. The courtroom hearing wasn't where this story would end. It was where it would begin. Because the evidence my grandmother left behind wasn't just protecting me. It was exposing a pattern someone believed had already disappeared. Once the shock faded, routine took over. Routine was my safest place. The space where emotion stepped aside and process took control. I cleared my dining table, opened a new case folder, and began organizing everything the way I would for any investigation. Journal entries on the left, bank records on the right, visitor logs centered between them. Within an hour, the scattered pieces transformed into a structured timeline. And timelines tell stories no one can easily argue with. The withdrawals no longer looked random. They formed phases. At first, small amounts framed as help. 2,000 here, 4,000 there. Then larger sums appeared once resistance disappeared. By the final months, withdrawals became routine, almost confident. Whoever controlled the situation believed oversight was gone. That realization chilled me more than anger ever could. Because exploitation isn't impulsive. It's calculated. Marcus arrived that afternoon carrying a thick legal pad and his usual calm expression. He reviewed the document silently while I watched him connect the same conclusions forming in my mind. After 20 minutes, he leaned back. "They didn't expect you to investigate," he said. "No," I replied. "They expected me to defend myself." He nodded. "That petition wasn't just about inheritance. It was preemptive. If the court declared you incompetent, your credibility disappears, which meant no one would trust any evidence I presented. The strategy suddenly felt obvious. Attack first. Discredit the only person capable of noticing inconsistencies. I felt a quiet anger rise. Not explosive, just steady. "They were trying to bury the records," I said. Marcus tapped the journal gently. "And your grandmother made sure that wouldn't happen." Legally, we could have filed everything immediately. Marcus explained our options carefully. Counterclaims, fraud allegations, requests for criminal review before the hearing. But something about rushing felt wrong. "They think they're winning," I said. He studied me closely. "You want them committed to their position." "Yes. If my mother withdrew early, consequences might disappear. The damage to my reputation would remain, but accountability wouldn't. I wanted the accusations spoken clearly under oath." Marcus gave a small approving nod. "Then we prepare quietly." Preparation became my full-time job. Each morning I reconstructed financial activity minute by minute. I verified account numbers, confirmed timestamps, and triple-checked sources. Every detail needed to survive scrutiny from opposing counsel and a judge. Patterns deepened the more I looked. Greg Halpern's financial troubles aligned perfectly with withdrawal dates. Property tax delinquencies appeared weeks before large transfers. Credit lines closed shortly after. The estate hadn't been temptation. It had been rescue money. And when rescue wasn't enough, they escalated. Midweek, Marcus forwarded notice of my deposition. Opposing counsel wanted sworn testimony before the hearing. Standard procedure, but strategically useful for them. They expected inconsistencies, emotional reactions, something they could frame as instability. I welcomed it. Because depositions reveal more about questioners than witnesses. Lucas found me working late again that night, surrounded by printed documents. "You've barely slept," he said gently. "I'm close," I replied without looking up. He hesitated before asking, "Are you angry?" The question surprised me. I paused, considering honestly. "No," I said finally. "I'm focused. Anger burns quickly. Focus lasts." He nodded slowly, beginning to understand. "You sound like you're back at work." I smiled faintly. I never really stopped. The next morning, I reviewed the power of attorney again. One detail stood out. Formatting inconsistent with recent legal templates. Fonts mismatched. Margins slightly off. Small flaws, but fraud often hides in imperfections, overlooked by people unfamiliar with documents. I compared it to verified Minnesota forms. The differences were undeniable. Someone had assembled paperwork using outdated materials. Sloppy. Confident people get careless. That afternoon, Marcus called again. "They've expanded their filing," he said, requesting emergency authority over estate accounts. My suspicion hardened into certainty. They were accelerating, which meant pressure was building somewhere else. Financial deadlines, creditors, something forcing urgency. "They're running out of time," I said quietly. Marcus agreed. "And that makes people make mistakes." By the end of the week, our evidence file was complete. 30 exhibits organized chronologically. Every accusation answered before it could be asked. I closed the folder and sat back, finally allowing myself a breath. For weeks, I had felt cornered. Now the roles had reversed. The hearing was no longer something to fear. It was an opportunity. Because once the courtroom doors opened, the story my mother created would collide with documented reality. And reality, unlike accusations, doesn't panic when questioned. The message arrived late on a Tuesday afternoon. Unknown number, short text. "Elena, this is Claire Halpern. I need to talk to you. Please." I stared at the screen longer than necessary. Claire was Greg Halpern's daughter, my stepsister by marriage, though we had barely spoken in nearly 20 years. The last time I had seen her, she'd been a quiet teenager standing behind my mother at a holiday gathering that never happened again. Now she wanted to meet. I forwarded the message to Marcus immediately. His response came within minutes. "Don't go alone. Could be intimidation or information phishing." He wasn't wrong. Opposing witnesses rarely reached out voluntarily during active litigation. Still, something about the message felt different. Not aggressive, not strategic, desperate. We agreed on neutral ground, a busy cafe in downtown Minneapolis, midday when crowds made private confrontations unlikely. I arrived early, choosing a table near the window where I could see both entrances. Old habits from investigations settled in automatically. Observe exits, watch reflections, notice body language. Claire arrived 10 minutes late. For a moment, I didn't recognize her. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, shoulders tense as if she expected someone to follow her inside. She ordered coffee but didn't drink it, hands wrapped tightly around the cup. "I'm sorry," she said immediately. No greeting, no small talk, just apology. I waited. Silence often invites honesty. "My dad wrote the statement I signed," she continued quietly. "The one saying you were unstable." I felt no surprise and only confirmation. "He told me it was necessary," she said, "that you were trying to steal from Grandma Ruth." Her voice faltered. I didn't know what was actually happening. I nodded slightly but didn't interrupt. People reveal more when they aren't rushed. Claire took a shaky breath. "You need to understand something," she said. "This isn't the first time." The words settled heavily between us. She explained slowly, choosing each sentence carefully. Years earlier, Greg had managed finances for his own mother after she developed dementia. He obtained power of attorney, claiming it was needed to handle medical bills. When she passed away, nearly all her assets were gone. At the time, the explanation seemed reasonable. Long-term care, expenses, debts. But later, Claire discovered transfers she couldn't reconcile. Money moving into accounts unrelated to medical care. Large withdrawals without documentation. "What happened when you asked him?" I said quietly. Her eyes dropped to the table. "He got angry," she whispered. "Really angry." She rubbed the inside of her wrist unconsciously. A small gesture that spoke louder than words. I didn't press further. Some truths don't need details to be understood. As she continued, the pattern became unmistakable. Isolation, legal control, gradual withdrawals. Family members convinced nothing was wrong until it was too late. My grandmother hadn't been an exception. She had been the next target. "I think my mom believed him," Claire said softly. "At first, but then they needed more money. Financial pressure again. The same urgency Marcus and I suspected." "Why tell me now?" I asked. Claire's eyes filled slightly. "Because they think they're about to win," she said. "And if they do, they'll keep doing this." She looked up at me directly for the first time. "I don't want to lie anymore." We talked for nearly an hour. Claire confirmed debts, failing investments, and mounting pressure that had worsened over the past year. She agreed to provide a written statement describing what she knew, voluntarily. Before leaving, she hesitated. "If I testify," she asked quietly, "will I get in trouble?" I answered honestly. "I can't promise outcomes, but cooperation matters." She nodded slowly. I just wanted to stop. Driving home, I felt something shift. Until now, the case had been defensive, proving my innocence. Now it had expanded into something larger, a pattern investigators would recognize immediately. I called Marcus from the car. When I finished explaining, he exhaled sharply. "This moves us into criminal territory," he said. "If authorities see what we see, this won't stay a probate issue." I looked at the traffic moving steadily ahead. For the first time, the outcome felt inevitable. That evening, Lucas listened while I explained everything. "They underestimated you," he said. I shook my head. "They underestimated documentation." He smiled faintly. "That might be worse." Maybe it was, because evidence doesn't argue. It accumulates. And once enough truth gathers in one place, it becomes impossible to ignore. The deposition room smelled faintly of coffee and printer toner, neutral walls, fluorescent lights, a long conference table designed to make conversations feel official even when they weren't. I had spent years in rooms like this, analyzing testimony, watching body language, identifying the moment someone realized their story was falling apart. Now I sat on the opposite side. A recorder clicked on. I was sworn in. Across the table, my mother's attorney, Richard Coleman, adjusted his glasses and smiled politely. The kind of smile meant to appear reassuring while setting a trap. My mother sat beside him, posture relaxed, hands folded calmly as if the outcome had already been decided. I kept my expression neutral. Let them feel comfortable. "Please state your full name," Coleman began. "Elena Marie Cross. And your occupation?" "I work in finance." His pen paused briefly. "What does that involve?" "I analyze financial records. Technically accurate, strategically incomplete." He nodded, writing something down. Already I could see the assumption forming. Accountant, not investigator. Good. He moved quickly into personal history. "You received counseling as a teenager?" "Yes." "For emotional instability following your parents' divorce?" "Yes." The phrasing was deliberate, designed to sound clinical. I didn't challenge it. Depositions reward patience, not correction. He continued. "Would you describe yourself as emotionally sensitive?" "Sometimes." "Do you experience stress easily?" "Like most people." Short answers, no elaboration. Across the table, my mother's shoulders relaxed slightly. She believed the narrative was working. Calm questioning, reinforcing her claims without resistance. Silence invites confidence. Confidence invites mistakes. After nearly an hour, Coleman's tone shifted. He began asking broader questions about responsibility, decision-making, and pressure. Each one subtly suggested instability without stating it directly. I answered evenly. No defensiveness, no emotion, just facts. Inside, I observed him the way I would any witness, noting when he stopped checking notes, when questions became conversational, when certainty replaced caution. He thought he understood me. That was the moment preparation began paying off. When the deposition ended, Coleman closed his folder with visible satisfaction. "No further questions," he said. Outside the room, Marcus waited. The moment the door shut, he raised an eyebrow. "You gave him almost nothing." "That was the goal." He laughed quietly. "He thinks you're overwhelmed." I nodded. "Perfect." Later that evening, I replayed the session mentally while reviewing our evidence file again. Depositions often reveal strategy more clearly than filings do. They weren't investigating facts. They were building a psychological portrait. If the judge believed I was emotionally fragile, every accusation would seem plausible, which meant they had underestimated one critical detail, my professional background, and they were about to commit fully to that mistake. 2 days later, Marcus called with an update. "They've filed an emergency motion again," he said, requesting temporary control over estate funds before the hearing. I almost smiled. Desperation accelerates bad decisions. "They need access quickly," I said. "Exactly," Marcus replied. "Financial pressure somewhere." The timeline matched everything Claire had told me. Debt deadlines approaching, options disappearing. The hearing wasn't just legal strategy for them. It was survival. Lucas came over that night carrying groceries instead of takeout. "I figured cooking might help," he said. We worked quietly in the kitchen, chopping vegetables while snow drifted past the window outside. The normalcy felt surreal compared to the tension building toward court. "You're different," he said finally. "How?" "You're not worried anymore." I considered that. He was right. Fear had disappeared somewhere between spreadsheets and sworn testimony. "I know what happened," I said. "Now it's just a matter of letting everyone else see it." He nodded slowly. "They walked into your world." I smiled faintly. "Yes." Before bed, I reviewed the evidence index one last time. 30 exhibits. Every claim supported. Every timeline verified. Nothing dramatic, just truth arranged carefully enough that denial would collapse under its own weight. I closed the folder and turned off the light. For weeks, my mother believed she controlled the story. Soon, she would realize something important. Stories change the moment facts are spoken under oath. The night before the hearing felt quieter than I expected. Not peaceful, just still, like the pause before a storm finally breaks. I drove to Maple Grove after sunset, parking across from my grandmother's house instead of pulling into the driveway. The porch light flicked on automatically as my car approached, triggered by the same motion sensor she had insisted on installing years ago. For a moment, I almost believed she would open the door. I stayed in the car. The house looked unchanged. Curtains drawn neatly, wind chimes swaying gently in the cold Minnesota air. Snow gathered along the edges of the lawn, untouched. Grief arrived suddenly, sharp and familiar. Tomorrow, everything she had written down would finally matter. I found it, I whispered quietly, unsure whether I was speaking to memory or myself. The words steadied me. Back at my apartment, Marcus had emailed the finalized exhibit list. 32 documents, each labeled, indexed, and cross-referenced. Bank statements aligned with visitor logs. Journal excerpts tied precisely to withdrawal dates. Verification records confirming the invalid notarization. Claire's sworn statement placed near the end. Not dramatic, just reinforcing what the numbers already proved. A strong case doesn't rely on surprise. It builds inevitability. I reviewed every page slowly, not searching for mistakes, but rehearsing the order in my mind. Years of courtroom work had taught me something essential. Judges don't react to emotion. They react to clarity. Lucas arrived around 9 carrying tea and a paper bag of pastries. "You ready?" he asked. "As ready as documentation allows," I said. He sat beside me on the couch, watching while I closed the laptop. "I always imagined courtrooms being loud," he admitted. "Arguments, shouting." "They're usually quiet," I said. "When someone starts getting loud, it usually means they're losing control." He smiled faintly. After a moment, he asked, "Are you nervous?" I thought carefully before answering. "No," I said. "I'm curious." "About what?" "How long it takes before they realize what's happening." Lucas laughed softly, then grew serious. "I've never seen you like this," he said. "Calm." "I know the facts now," I replied. "Facts are easier than uncertainty." Later, I laid out my clothes for the morning. Simple navy blazer, plain blouse, nothing memorable. Courtrooms reward professionalism, not performance. I placed my grandmother's pearl earrings beside my watch. Wearing them wasn't symbolic to anyone else, but to me they felt like carrying her voice into the room. Quiet, steady, patient. Before going to bed, I opened the journal one last time. The final entry sat near the back, written only weeks before her death. Paper trails don't argue, they wait. I closed the cover gently. Tomorrow they would finally speak. Sleep came slowly. Memories surfaced in fragments. Mornings at her kitchen table, calculator buttons clicking, the smell of coffee drifting through sunlight. She had always believed preparation solved fear, and for the first time since the legal notice arrived, I understood what she meant. Around midnight, my phone buzzed. A message from Marcus. "Everything is ready. Let them talk first." I smiled slightly. That had always been the strategy. Let confidence carry them forward. Because once accusations are spoken under oath, they can't be taken back. Morning arrived clear and cold. I reached the Hennepin County Government Center early, as usual. The building rose against the winter sky, its glass reflecting pale sunlight. Inside, security lines moved slowly while attorneys reviewed notes and whispered final preparations. The familiarity felt strange. I had walked into courtrooms many times before, just never as the accused. Marcus met me near the courtroom doors, briefcase already in hand. "They're here," he said quietly. I followed his gaze. My mother stood at the far end of the hallway speaking confidently with Richard Coleman. Greg Halpern leaned against the wall beside them, arms crossed, expression calm. They looked relaxed, certain. For a brief moment, my mother glanced toward me. Our eyes met. 19 years of silence sat between us. She didn't look angry. She looked assured, like someone moments away from winning. The bailiff opened the doors. "All parties may enter." I took a slow breath and stepped inside. The waiting was over. Now truth only needed time. Courtroom 412 felt smaller once everyone took their seats. The air carried that familiar stillness I had felt during dozens of past hearings. The quiet tension that settles just before something important happens. Papers shuffled softly. The clerk adjusted her monitor. Somewhere behind me, a chair scraped against the floor as late observers slipped into the back row. I sat beside Marcus at the respondents' table, hands folded calmly over a blank legal pad. Across the aisle, my mother looked confident. Diane Halpern wore a tailored blazer and an expression of careful concern, the kind meant to signal compassion to strangers. Greg sat beside her, arms crossed, posture relaxed, as though the outcome had already been decided. They looked prepared. They just weren't prepared for reality. All rise. Judge Marianne Whitaker entered and took her seat, scanning the case file briefly before looking up. Her gaze paused on me. Recognition flickered. Subtle, but unmistakable. I had testified in her courtroom before, explaining financial timelines in unrelated cases. She said nothing, but the slight tilt of her head told me she remembered. "Counselor," she said, turning to opposing counsel, "you may proceed." Richard Coleman stood immediately. His opening statement was smooth and confident. He described a worried mother attempting to protect her daughter from poor decisions. He spoke about emotional instability, isolation, and a vulnerable elderly woman allegedly manipulated during cognitive decline. Every sentence sounded reasonable to someone unfamiliar with facts. I didn't react. Let them build the story. That was always the plan. When Coleman finished, the judge nodded. "Does the petitioner wish to make a statement?" My mother stood. At first, her voice sounded measured, almost sympathetic. She spoke about regret, about wanting reconciliation, about concern for my well-being. Then emotion crept in. Her voice sharpened. "She has always been unstable," she said, pointing toward me. "She shouldn't be trusted with finances. My mother didn't understand what she was doing near the end." The accusation echoed across the quiet courtroom. I remained still. No objection, no reaction. Silence stretched long enough to feel uncomfortable. Judge Whitaker watched carefully, expression unreadable. Then she leaned forward slightly and turned toward Coleman. Her voice remained calm. "Counselor," she said, "do you truly have no idea who this woman is?" Coleman blinked. He glanced at his notes. "She is the respondent, Your Honor, an accountant." The judge tilted her head. "Is that all?" The hesitation that followed changed the atmosphere instantly. Coleman looked uncertain for the first time. Marcus stood beside me. "Your Honor," he said evenly, "the respondent requests permission to present evidence clarifying the court's understanding of this matter." The judge nodded. "Proceed." Marcus handed the first folder to the clerk, who distributed copies across the courtroom. "We'll begin with financial records," he said. He walked through the timeline calmly. 7 withdrawals. $48,000 removed over 11 months. Each withdrawal occurring within days of documented visits from Diane Halpern. Coleman's expression remained confident at first. expecting explanation or coincidence. Then Marcus introduced the journal. He read selected passages aloud. My grandmother's own words described confusion, pressure, and regret after signing documents she did not fully understand. The room grew very quiet. My mother's posture stiffened. Next came the power of attorney. Marcus highlighted the notarization seal, then presented certification records confirming the notary's commission had expired years before the document's date. Coleman's face lost color. He flipped pages rapidly, searching for something to counter the evidence. There was nothing, Marcus continued methodically. Financial records tied to Greg Halpern's debts, matching timelines, pattern similarities to prior estate activity. Finally, he said the words that shifted everything. Copies of this evidence have been provided to investigative authorities for review regarding potential financial exploitation. Silence followed, heavy and final. Judge Whitaker looked toward opposing counsel. "Mr. Coleman," she said, "do you wish to respond?" Coleman leaned toward my mother, whispering urgently. I watched her expression change, confidence dissolving into confusion, then fear. For the first time since this began, she truly looked at me, and realization arrived. She finally understood who had been sitting quietly across from her all along. Coleman stood slowly. "Your Honor, the petitioner wishes to withdraw her motion." The judge's expression hardened slightly. "I don't believe withdrawal will resolve the concerns now before this court." In that moment, the outcome became inevitable. The story they created had collapsed, not through argument, but through proof. Judge Whitaker let the silence linger before she spoke again. Courtrooms have a rhythm, moments where everyone understands the decision before it is officially announced. This was one of those moments. No one moved. Even the clerk's hands rested motionless above the keyboard. "The petition requesting conservatorship," the judge said evenly, "is denied." She paused just long enough for the words to settle. "With prejudice." A quiet breath escaped somewhere behind me. The phrase carried finality, the accusations questioning my sanity, my competence, my integrity. All of it ended permanently in a single ruling. But the judge continued. "Based on the evidence presented," she said, turning a page slowly, "this court finds credible indication of financial exploitation and potential fraud. The record will be referred to the Hennepin County Attorney's Office, and copies will be forwarded to federal authorities for further investigation." My mother's attorney lowered his gaze. Greg Halpern sat rigidly still, jaw tight, as though refusing to react might somehow undo what had just happened. For weeks they had spoken with certainty. Now certainty belonged to the evidence. The hearing ended quietly. No shouting, no dramatic confrontation, just paperwork gathered, chairs pushed back, and people leaving a room where the outcome had already reshaped several lives. Outside the courtroom, Lucas wrapped his arms around me before I realized how tense my shoulders had been. "It's over," he said softly. I nodded, though I understood something he didn't yet. Court decisions end arguments. They don't end consequences. 3 days later, my phone rang while I was organizing files at home. "Ms. Cross?" a woman asked. "This is Special Agent Karen Morales with the FBI." Her tone was professional and direct. Investigators had reviewed the evidence submitted during the hearing and opened a formal inquiry into financial exploitation involving Greg and Diane Halpern. Subpoenas followed quickly. Bank transfers traced across multiple accounts. Old estate records reopened. Patterns expanded once specialists began looking. What I had uncovered was only the beginning. Arrests were made early one morning in April. Federal charges included wire fraud, mail fraud, and exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Claire cooperated fully with investigators, providing testimony about financial activities she had witnessed over the years. I didn't attend the arrest. I didn't need to. Documentation had already done the work. The trial lasted 2 weeks. I testified once, explaining financial timelines exactly as I would in any professional case. Sitting in the witness chair felt familiar again. Calm, structured, grounded in facts. The verdict came quickly. Greg Halpern received 6.5 years in federal prison. My mother was sentenced to 5. Restitution was ordered for every dollar taken from my grandmother's accounts. When I heard the sentence, I expected relief. Instead, I felt something quieter. Balance. My firm reinstated me the following week. My supervisor apologized for the administrative leave, though I never blamed him. Institutions protect credibility first. I understood that better than most. My first case back involved an elderly man whose nephew had quietly drained his savings. We recovered every cent. When he thanked me, his voice shaking with relief, I thought about my grandmother, about the journal she left behind, about how carefully she had written everything down so the truth wouldn't disappear with her. I kept the house in Maple Grove. On weekends, Lucas and I sit on the porch where she used to balance her checkbook every Sunday morning. The wind chimes still sound the same. The neighborhood remains quiet. Her journal rests on a shelf now, no longer evidence, just memory preserved in ink. Lucas proposed that autumn at a small restaurant overlooking the river where we had our first date. I said yes before he finished asking. Life moved forward, quietly. People often think justice feels dramatic. It doesn't. Real justice is patient, methodical, built slowly through details most people overlook. My mother believed silence meant weakness. She believed patience meant surrender. What she never understood was that I had been raised by a woman who kept records, a woman who trusted truth enough to write it down and wait. And in the end, truth didn't need to shout. It only needed time. If this story stayed with you, you already know something important. The smallest details often hold the biggest truths, especially for those who stay until the very end.